$780 billion. That is the value of global grain trade Canada just repositioned away from automatic American access. Not through government decree, not through export bans, through infrastructure decisions, diversification strategies, and buyer relationships that took 18 months to build while Trump was busy threatening annexation. American grain buyers who assumed Canadian wheat, barley, and canola would flow south by default are discovering those assumptions no longer hold. Port capacity that used to funnel prairie harvest to Minneapolis is now shipping to Indonesia. Rail lines that fed Montana processing plants are redirecting to Vancouver for Asian export. Buyers in Bangladesh, Nigeria, and the Philippines who used to purchase through American intermediaries are now contracting directly with Canadian exporters. This was not announced with press conferences or diplomatic summits. This was executed through quiet infrastructure expansions, new trade partnerships, and supply chain reconfigurations that became irreversible before Washington noticed what was happening. And the economic consequences are devastating American agricultural middlemen, grain processors, and logistics companies that built business models on the assumption that Canadian grain had nowhere else to go. Tonight, we are showing you how Canada's grain trade diversification is locking American buyers out of supply chains they considered guaranteed. How Trump's tariff threats accelerated a strategic pivot that redirects billions in agricultural commerce to Asia, the Middle East, and direct consumer markets. And how the North American grain trade that defined agricultural economics for generations just became optional rather than inevitable. Here's what nobody's discussing. Canada's grain trade shift didn't start with tariffs. It started with China's punitive duties that forced Canada to prove it could survive without its second largest market. On March 20th, 2025, China imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, plus 25% on pork and seafood. Then on August 14th, 2025, China added a 75.8% duty on canola seed shipments, total value of blocked exports, over $4.2 billion annually. Saskatchewan canola farmers watched their second largest market disappear overnight. Exports fell 21% year over year through the first 22 weeks of the 2025 to 26 crop year. Everyone expected Canadian agriculture to collapse under the pressure. Trade analysts predicted billions in losses. American buyers assumed desperate Canadian farmers would accept whatever prices U.S. processors offered. They were utterly incorrect. While China was imposing tariffs, Canada was building alternatives. Richardson International opened a new canola oil export terminal in Prince Rupert, British Columbia in September 2025. Capacity 1 million metric tons annually. The facility connects prairie production directly to coastal shipping with underground pipelines to vessels, eliminating American intermediaries entirely. Export destinations shifted within months. Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia absorbed volumes that used to flow to China. Canadian canola oil exports targeting renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel markets on the U.S. West Coast continued, but now Canadian exporters controlled the relationship rather than depending on American buyers to provide market access. The numbers are structural. Canada exported 3.5 million metric tons of canola oil in 2024 worth $5.9 billion Canadian. When China blocked access, that volume didn't disappear. It rerouted. And once new buyers discovered Canadian supply reliability, they signed long-term contracts that locked in relationships independent of American trade routes. Wheat followed the same pattern. Canada exported 26.2 million tons of wheat to over 80 countries in the 2024-25 crop year. Top destinations: China 14%, Indonesia 12%, Japan 8%, Bangladesh 8%, United States 7%. Notice that ranking. The U.S. is fifth, not first, not second, fifth, and falling. Barley trade tells the story even more clearly. China takes 70% of Canadian barley grain exports. Japan takes 20%. The United States gets 10%. Canada shipped over 1.5 million tons to China in the past 12 months, representing 80% of all Canadian barley exports. When Trump started threatening tariffs on Canadian agriculture, that trade didn't stop. It intensified because China wanted to ensure reliable supply independent of American disruption. This matters because agricultural trade creates path dependency. Once buyers configure supply chains, adjust processing equipment, and establish logistics relationships, switching back is expensive and disruptive. Canadian grain flowing to Asia through Pacific ports doesn't automatically return to American routes just because political tensions ease. Why did Canada accelerate grain trade diversification in 2025? The obvious answer, Trump's tariff threats made alternatives urgent, but the real timing reveals something deeper. January 2025, Trump inauguration. Immediate threats of 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports unless Canada makes a deal on border security and energy pricing. Translation, surrender sovereignty or face economic punishment. March 20th, 2025, China imposes canola tariffs. Canadian agriculture faces simultaneous pressure from largest trading partner and second largest export market. The two-front trade war forces immediate diversification. June 27th, 2025, Statistics Canada releases planting data showing Canadian farmers shifting from canola toward wheat. Why? Wheat exports are highly diversified across dozens of countries. Canola is concentrated in U.S. and China. When both markets become unreliable, farmers plant crops with broader market access. September 2025, Richardson International opens Prince Rupert Canola Terminal. Infrastructure that takes years to plan and build comes online exactly when needed, proving the diversification strategy was prepared long before Trump's threats. October 2025, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada projects wheat exports will increase by 250,000 tons in 2024 to 25 due to stronger global demand for higher quality and protein grade wheat. Translation, global buyers are choosing Canadian wheat over American alternatives. The sequence matters because each step was designed to create irreversible momentum. By the time Trump's tariff threats became explicit, Canadian grain infrastructure was already redirecting to non-American markets. Farmers were already planting for diversified exports. Buyers in Asia and the Middle East were already signing contracts, and American grain processors were already losing access to supply they considered guaranteed. Canada didn't announce the grain trade reset and then scramble to build alternatives. Canada built the alternatives, the port capacity, the buyer relationships, the farmer decisions, the logistics networks, and let the trade flows speak for themselves. That's not reactive policy. That's strategic repositioning executed before the opponent realizes the game changed. While Trump was tweeting about annexation, Canada was signing grain contracts with Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. The diversification strategy has three phases, each designed to lock in trade flows independent of American access. Phase 1, infrastructure expansion, already complete. Prince Rupert Canola Terminal operational September 2025. Vancouver port expansions increasing grain handling capacity by 15%. Rail investments prioritizing Pacific export routes over southbound connections to U.S. border crossings. Short-term result, Canada can ship more grain to Asian markets faster than ever before. American buyers lose first-mover advantage on prairie harvests. Phase 2, direct buyer relationships. Executing now, Canadian exporters are bypassing American intermediaries and contracting directly with end users in Asia, Middle East, Africa. Indonesia, Japan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, all buying Canadian wheat without American middlemen taking margins. Medium-term result, American grain processors and logistics companies lose billions in fees, storage revenue, and transportation markups they use to extract from Canadian to Asia grain flows. Phase 3, crop mix adjustment, next 24 months. Canadian farmers shifting acreage from canola toward wheat because wheat markets are more diversified. If U.S. and China both become unreliable, wheat provides 80-plus export destinations versus canola's concentration in 2 markets. Long-term result, even if tariffs disappear, Canadian farmers won't shift back to canola at previous levels because they've learned the risk of market concentration. Crop decisions made in 2025-2027 shape production for the next decade. Here's what this structure reveals. Canada isn't abandoning American grain buyers. Canada is making them optional rather than essential. If Trump imposes devastating tariffs, Canadian grain flows to Asia, Middle East, Africa. If American buyers offer competitive prices and reliable access, Canadian exporters will sell to them. But the relationship is now transactional rather than dependent. American buyers have to compete for Canadian supply instead of assuming they get first access by geographic proximity. Option A was automatic American access. Prairie grain flows south by default. U.S. processors control margins. Canadian farmers accept whatever terms Americans offer. Option B is global competition. Canadian grain goes to whoever offers best prices and most reliable long-term relationships, with infrastructure built to serve multiple markets simultaneously. Canada chose option B, and the infrastructure investments, farmer planning decisions, and buyer relationships that make option B viable are already operational. Canadian officials are choosing their words carefully when discussing grain trade diversification. Foreign Minister Anita Anand, speaking in Beijing on January 13, 2026. We will be exploring several opportunities for collaboration between the broader populations, in addition to examining the trade and economic relationship. She described bilateral Canada-China ties as complex. Notice what wasn't said. She didn't say Canada is reconsidering American trade relationships. She said Canada is exploring opportunities beyond existing partnerships, implying current relationships are insufficient. She didn't say China trade is replacing other markets. She said ties are complex, acknowledging political tensions while pursuing economic pragmatism. She didn't mention the United States at all in her Beijing statement. The omission speaks louder than any criticism. Agriculture and Agri-Food Minister Heath MacDonald, speaking at a Singapore partnership launch in January 2026. This opportunity is driven by young families looking for higher nutrient levels in the food they consume. Our conversation started with these intentions alongside the goal of building cross-ecosystem education on both sides. Translation: Canada is positioning itself as the premium supplier of sustainable, high-quality grain to Asia's growing middle class, a market worth hundreds of billions over the next decade. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, in his letter demanding canola tariff relief. The current policy has created a two-front trade war that disproportionately affects Western Canada. Notice he said two-front trade war, not China's tariffs. Two-front, meaning China and the United States both creating problems simultaneously. Prairie premiers understand that Trump's threats are as damaging as Beijing's tariffs, and they want alternatives to both. The most revealing silence: no American agricultural official has publicly commented on Canada's grain trade diversification, not the USDA, not agriculture secretaries from border states, nobody. Either they don't understand what's happening, or they recognize that public pressure would backfire by proving Canada is right to build alternatives to American-dependent trade routes. Either way, the silence confirms that Washington has no effective response to a strategy that locks American buyers out of supply chains through infrastructure decisions and buyer relationships rather than tariffs or export restrictions. Australia faced this exact pattern in 2020-2023. China imposed punitive tariffs on Australian barley, wine, beef, coal, and timber after Australia called for COVID-19 origin investigations. Total blocked exports, over $20 billion annually. Beijing assumed economic pressure would force Canberra to soften criticism of Chinese policies. Australia didn't capitulate. Prime Minister Scott Morrison maintained positions on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and South China Sea despite billions in trade losses. Australian exporters diversified. Barley went to Middle East markets. Wine found buyers in UK, US, Canada. Coal exports shifted to India and Japan. Beef redirected to Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Americas. By late 2023, China quietly started lifting restrictions. Not because Australia changed policies, because China needed what Australia was selling. And Australian exporters had proven they could survive and thrive without Chinese market access. The lesson: economic coercion works only if the target has no alternatives and believes the punishment is permanent. If the target builds alternatives and demonstrates viability, leverage reverses and the coercing party loses more than the target. Canada studied the Australia precedent obsessively. Leif Carlson, Director of Market Intelligence and Trade Policy at Cereals Canada, explicitly referenced Australia's diversification success in multiple 2025 briefings when explaining Canada's strategy. The difference is that Canada has advantages Australia lacked: Canada is geographically closer to Asian markets via Pacific ports. Canada produces broader crop varieties with applications in food, fuel, and feed. Canada has existing trade infrastructure from decades of Pacific export experience. If Australia could withstand Chinese economic pressure and emerge stronger, Canada can do the same. And if Canada builds alternatives to both Chinese and American market dependence simultaneously, Canada gains leverage neither Australia nor any other middle power has achieved: the ability to play two superpowers against each other while maintaining sovereignty from both. This isn't about wheat statistics and canola tonnage. It's about whether middle powers can exercise economic sovereignty when caught between great power competition. When the United States threatens tariffs on allied agricultural exports while simultaneously demanding those allies maintain exclusive trade relationships with American buyers, what message does that send? That American market access is conditional on political subordination, that agricultural trade is a tool of coercion rather than mutual benefit, that allies should build their entire agricultural sectors around American buyers who can withdraw access on presidential whim. When China offers to lift tariffs in exchange for policy changes, what message does that send? That economic engagement requires ideological alignment, that trade relationships are weapons in great power competition, that middle powers must choose sides rather than maintaining relationships with multiple partners. For decades, Canadian agricultural trade operated on assumptions everyone treated as permanent. Prairie grain would flow to American processors by geographic default. Asian buyers would purchase Canadian grain through American intermediaries. Canadian farmers would accept whatever prices American buyers offered because there were no alternatives. American infrastructure, rail ports, processing facilities would control the margins on Canadian agricultural exports. That model just collapsed, not because Canada stopped valuing trade with the United States, because Trump weaponized that trade relationship while China simultaneously blocked market access. And Canada realized that dependence on either superpower was strategic vulnerability. Canadian grain flowing to 80+ countries through infrastructure designed for global access is not anti-American trade policy. It's risk management. If American buyers offer competitive prices and reliable relationships, Canadian exporters will sell to them. If China lifts tariffs and stops using trade as political leverage, Canadian farmers will sell there too. But if either superpower decides to weaponize agricultural trade, Canada now has the infrastructure, buyer relationships, and crop diversity to redirect exports within months rather than years. This is the fundamental logic reshaping agricultural trade in the 21st century. Middle powers caught between superpowers don't maximize trade with one partner and hope that partner never weaponizes the dependence. They build infrastructure and relationships that make every major market optional rather than essential. India is pursuing this strategy with energy imports. Vietnam is doing it with manufacturing supply chains. Brazil executed this successfully for years before Bolsonaro abandoned the approach. Canada is now applying the same logic to agricultural trade, not because Canada wants to undermine North American integration, because Trump's threats made clear that integration without sovereignty is subordination, and subordination is unacceptable. The damage isn't reversible by dropping tariffs or changing administrations. Once Canadian grain starts flowing to Asian buyers at scale, switching back requires those buyers to find alternative suppliers, adjust logistics, and rebuild supply chains. Buyers don't do that unless forced. They sign long-term contracts to lock in reliable supply. Once Canadian farmers plant wheat instead of canola because wheat has more diversified markets, they don't automatically switch back. Crop rotations, equipment investments, and agronomic practices built around wheat production persist for years. Once rail companies and port operators invest billions in Pacific export capacity, that infrastructure doesn't disappear. It operates for decades, creating permanent capacity for non-American grain export routes. Once American grain processors lose access to Canadian supply, they either close facilities or source from other countries at higher cost. Workers lose jobs. Communities lose economic activity. Political pressure builds on elected officials to fix trade relationships, but the leverage to demand terms is gone because Canadian supply is no longer dependent on American market access. The structural changes are permanent because reversing them costs more than maintaining them. This creates 4 irreversible consequences. First, American grain processors and logistics companies permanently lose billions in revenue from handling Canadian grain destined for Asian markets. Canadian exporters ship direct, keeping margins that used to flow to American intermediaries. Second, Asian buyers gain reliable access to high-quality Canadian grain without depending on American supply chain stability. Better than market concentration, diversification without political risk. Third, future Canadian governments inherit infrastructure and buyer relationships that make American market access optional rather than essential. Policy inertia favors maintaining diversified exports over returning to U.S.-dependent trade routes. Fourth, other American agricultural trading partners, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, watch Canada successfully reduce U.S. dependence without catastrophic consequences. They start asking, if Canada can do this with grain, why can't we do it with beef, soybeans, and corn? The precedent is the real threat to American agricultural dominance. Trump can threaten all he wants, but he can't force Canadian grain to flow south without devastating American consumers who depend on Canadian imports. Trump could try imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian wheat and barley, but that would spike bread, beer, and livestock feed prices across the United States. American consumers would pay the tariff, not Canadian farmers who would simply sell to Asian buyers instead. Could try blocking Canadian grain exports by threatening secondary sanctions on shipping companies, but that would prove U.S. willingness to weaponize food trade against allies, pushing every food importing nation toward de-dollarization and alternatives to U.S.-controlled agricultural supply chains. Could try pressuring Asian buyers to reject Canadian grain, but Indonesia, Bangladesh, Japan, and Nigeria need reliable grain supply more than they need to please Washington. They won't sacrifice food security to help Trump control Canada. Could try offering Canadian farmers better prices to compete with Asian buyers, but Trump already burned that option by threatening annexation, imposing tariffs, and treating Canada as subordinate territory rather than sovereign trading partner. The leverage is gone. Trump's threats pushed Canada to build alternatives. Now, those alternatives exist. Trump can't threaten Canada back into exclusive dependence without costs he's unwilling to pay, higher food prices for American consumers, closed processing plants in border states, and proof to every American ally that depending on U.S. markets is strategic vulnerability. The only move Trump has left is accepting that Canada is no longer an automatic supplier to American grain buyers and negotiating competitive terms. But Trump doesn't negotiate with equals. He demands submission or issues threats. So Canada keeps building alternatives while Trump keeps issuing threats that prove exactly why Canada needs those alternatives. The North American grain trade that defined agricultural commerce for 75 years is fundamentally different now, not because Canada chose Asia over America, because Trump made American market access conditional on Canadian submission and Canada refused. When Canadian grain flows to 80-plus countries through infrastructure designed for global competition, that's not abandoning the United States. That's ending exclusive American access to supply that American buyers assumed was guaranteed by geography. For generations, American agricultural companies assumed prairie grain would flow south by default. Rocky Mountains to the west, Arctic to the north, Pacific requiring expensive infrastructure to the west, U.S. border directly south with established rail and processing networks. Where else could Canadian grain go? Prince Rupert answered that question. Asia, through infrastructure that bypasses American processors, American rail companies, American ports, and American intermediaries entirely. Trump wanted to force Canadian agricultural submission through tariff threats. Instead, he forced Canada to build infrastructure that makes those threats irrelevant. Another example of how treating allies like subordinates pushes them to build alternatives. The grain trade relationship that made American agricultural dominance possible in North America wasn't coercion. It was partnership based on competitive prices, reliable access, and geographic convenience. Trump traded partnership for domination, and Canada traded dependence for sovereignty, not by rejecting American buyers, by refusing to accept that trade requires submission to political pressure. Canadian grain will flow to whoever offers best prices and most reliable relationships, whether that's American processors, Asian buyers, European importers, or Middle Eastern consumers. Geography no longer determines destiny. Infrastructure does. and Canada just built infrastructure that makes American access optional rather than inevitable.